to start by asking you about the Neruda. It's a poem I don't know for some reason, but say why you chose that poem.
I came across that poem when I was about 17, and at the age of 17 I decided that I wanted to become a poet. I hadn't read much poetry at that stage, but I saw this poem and I was just, I think, struck by the absolute beauty of it, the tenderness of the emotions and the sentiment, and just the lovely naming of things that he does. I think at the end there, you know, the poppy, the water, there's so many nouns in that poem, and I just thought it was so beautiful. It was such a lovely kind of affirming, graceful poem, full of love, and it just really appealed to me. It's lovely.
So I'd like to begin, talking to you about, because I also like to welcome the person as well as the poet as well. So I thought it'd be nice to hear a little bit about your background, your childhood. It starts making me sound like a psychoanalyst, but what kind of world you came from? Do you come from a literary world, for instance?
Not really, no. I was born in England. My father was Scottish. We came out here in 1960 when I was 3. My parents were just, they were educated people, but they didn't have a lot of opportunity in life. My father was a clerk. My mother ended up running the school tuck shop. We moved to the western suburbs of Sydney, which back in the 60s were pretty dreary, I must admit. But books were always important in our house. You know, my father used to go to the library and borrow books for my brother and I, so reading was always encouraged and that sort of thing. I was pathologically shy as a child. I couldn't even go into a shop and ask for an ice cream. It was just too big a deal to do that. So I guess in some ways I lived in my own world rather a lot. I liked my own company, found solace, I suppose, in my imagination and reading and learning things. And I think eventually that kind of really just led to starting to write things down, initially, and I think this is probably true for a lot of people, that you start off writing poetry as a kind of therapy, to deal with your feelings and experiences and so forth. So I started to do that. But the more I did it, the more I realised that I actually really enjoyed doing it, and I liked getting to know myself through the word, through writing things down. And I'd always taken my writing very seriously. Even as a young child, I spent hours on my school essays and compositions. So from early on, I had a sense that the word was an important thing, and if you could get the word right, then there was a kind of pleasure and also a kind of power in that as well. So by the time I sort of finished high school, I had pretty much decided that all I wanted to do was to write poetry. My next thing that I did was to do an arts degree, which enabled me to study literature a bit, and also there was a creative writing component, so I was able to start my creative practice, basically.
And, of course, the other thing I wanted to ask you about is the influence of Buddhism on you. I've been writing books about Buddhism for many years, and I've been writing a few even poems about the Buddha. So I was quite struck to read your collection of David Dasa's poems, which is a whole book of poems about the cousin of the Buddha. So I wanted to ask you what drew you to that story, and what perhaps even the place of Buddhism is in your life.
I grew up in a Baptist household. If anyone knows anything about what the Baptists were like, it was a pretty sort of strict state of affairs. I was never happy with all that, and in fact I used to grow up with so much guilt because I just never felt comfortable about what was sort of being asked of me, I suppose, through Christianity. So again, round about 17 and into my early 20s, I was exploring Eastern religions, and it just felt right. As soon as I came across, the ideas of interconnectedness and, compassion for animals and so forth, it just felt, this is what I've been searching for. So I've always loved the Buddhist story. I remember once, when I was about 8 or 9, I won a Sunday school prize, and it was a book called Many Paths, One Heaven. And it was the stories of all the great religious leaders. And the story that struck me most was the Buddhist story. I just thought, oh, this is a remarkable story. This person who lived in all this luxury, left all that behind and went on this incredible journey of enlightenment and so forth. And that story just always stayed with me ever since I was a young child. That as a story has always been with me, and I've written, as you said, about that in my poetry. It's just been a story that, for some reason, has always, struck my imagination as being very heroic.
Yes, and it's interesting because it's the David Doss's poem, the long sequence of poems, a sort of gradually darkening sequence of poems as you read it. And it's a sequence it sort of completes that sequence you've written in Wolf Notes between the palace and the Bodhi tree. I was wondering whether did you set out to write a long sequence? It's quite an ambitious sequence. Did you set out to write a long sequence? Is writing in sequence an important part of your response to poetry?
I did set out to write a book length on Devadatta. I think increasingly, and certainly probably in the last 20 years, I guess, maybe not quite that long, I've been very interested in character in poetry and using characters, to generate a narrative and also to generate content, and just, to look at the kind of psychological issues around, certain characters, putting them in certain environments and seeing what happens to them. So I've been using character a lot in the last 20 years or so. And Devadatta, that story always struck me as being incredibly dramatic. I mean, there's jealousy, there's attempted murder, there's power struggles, there's the whole kind of gamut of human failings within that story, and I thought, gee, this would be great to write about.
I mean, I was wondering, was it the story, because there's this wonderful mixture in those poems of sort of beauty and treachery. There's a lot of beauty in the poems, but there's also this sort of treachery, and it's a sequence of poems about spiritual jealousy. I wonder, is there anything, I'm not suggesting that treachery is spiritual jealousy or some sort of personal renovation, but why drawn to that, do you think, or it's just a story?
I guess because it's such a human story, power struggles, jealousy, and it just seemed to me to encapsulate so much about the human struggle. But in writing the Devadatta poems, I didn't want to make him all bad.
No, that's right. That's striking in that way.
I wanted to sort of flesh him out in a much more human way, and perhaps show some other side of the character.
I mean, the other thing that's been striking me reading your poems, I'm struck by your willingness to imagine hardship and poverty. Just arriving in Sydney, it's like arriving in paradise. I was saying yesterday, and that's only the cafes. I haven't even got to the beach yet. But I'm struck in the poems that, like in Saffron Pickers, for instance, in Wolf Notes, a real imaginative sympathy for poverty, for hardship. You seem to be, in your poems, quite... you want to step outside yourself, it seems to me, and imagine through the lives of others, and through the lives of others distant from you in both time and space. I don't know whether those...
Yes, no, that's a very good observation. I very rarely write personal poems, you know, that are directly about my own life. So I like to, as you say, imagine or use other voices or characters to make an observation or to comment on something. And I guess it's that, I mean, I think a lot of writers do this, and they use their writing actually to get outside themselves a bit and to feel that connection with others. And I like doing that. I like imagining how it might feel to be someone else in an entirely different situation.
And do you think, because often when people do that, they go to the novel, don't they, as their way of doing that? Why have you? Because it's quite unusual. I think it's quite unusual for someone for so long to be exploring different characters in that way. You can think of examples, but they usually write personal poems as much as. And I haven't seen any personal poems yet. I don't know if that's because I haven't looked well enough. But you know, is there a reticence for you about the confessional, as it were?
It's not that, it's just that I find my imagination comes much more alive when I start to write about something I don't know too much about, because it gives me room to move, if you like, room to imagine and to invent scenarios or situations. And that's much more interesting to me than just writing about myself. Because I think in a way I always write to discover what it is I don't know that I know. And that's what I like about writing. It's always for me a process of discovery, that I want to actually learn something in this writing process. I don't want to write something that I'm already aware of or familiar with. That doesn't interest me at all. So I like the aspect of writing where you don't really know where you're going. That sort of journey element to it is much more exciting for me.
Yeah, indeed. So I'll come back to you in a moment, Judith. So I don't know how you do this. I should have watched more chat shows anyway. I'm going to invite Stephen to join us, and then hopefully we'll try and get a three-way conversation going at some point. Yeah, you say that one. Yeah. I think we're all just about fit. We've all been told not to gesticulate wildly or get overexcited. Actually, poets very rarely get overexcited, but you never know. So welcome, Stephen. First of all, yes, just as before, I wanted to ask you about your choice of Dylan Thomas. It seems a strange influence in a way, because your own work seems very wary of that kind of grandiloquence that Thomas is so often criticised for, although actually I think he's really quite brilliant. But can you say something about Thomas's influence on you?
Well, like Judy, I began writing in my adolescence when I was about 15 or so, at high school obviously. And it just so happened that our school library, I went to Sydney Technical High School, our school library had a first edition of 18 poems, Dylan Thomas's first book, which I discovered at about this time when I was beginning to write, a few months after I'd started writing, really. And I suppose I was searching for some sort of, a formative influence. And I took it home, and I couldn't understand a word of it. To begin with, but I was absolutely, intoxicated by the music of it and just the extravagant language. And I think I kept that book at home on permanent loan for the rest of my high school life, and spent the next 18 months pretending to be Dylan Thomas, really, in my writing, not in my behaviour, I hasten to add. So it was, well, in two ways it was a strong influence. I did write a lot of that kind of, linguistically extravagant sort of stuff there, and then I've spent, I suppose, many decades trying to get it out of the system in a way, or to find, my own voice. But I learnt a lot of technical things because right from the very beginning I was drawn to, formal structures in poetry, stanza shapes and rhyme schemes and things like that. And Dylan Thomas is a highly formal poet, although he tended to write syllabics a lot of the time rather than meters. But anyway, I mean, simply by imitating him, I did learn a lot of very useful technical skills.
It's interesting with Thomas as well, isn't it? Because it's sort of, at least in the UK, it's slightly fashionable to be sort of down on Thomas. I slightly think it's because he's quite an influence still, and people like to badmouth their father, but not their grandfather. It still seems to me a real poet, doesn't it? Whatever you end up with.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, he probably wrote only a fairly small number of truly successful poems, but they are terrific poems, I think.
So you were talking just there about your formal, your interest in formal poetry. We were just chatting before. I first discovered Stephen's poetry by reading Clive James' wonderful book called The Poetry Notebook. I don't know whether you've read it, but it's one of the best books on poetry I've read for many years, I think. I didn't know Clive James was a poetry critic. I just thought of him as a light entertainer. But he's, I don't know, you've read his work, but he's wonderfully cultured in the best sense, without being sort of pompous and super sophisticated and so on. Anyway, James writes wonderfully about Stephen's work, and I rushed out and bought a copy of New and Selected Poems. And of course, the first thing that struck me about your poems is your commitment, and I think commitment is the right word, to formal verse, to the discipline of metre and rhyme. Can you say something about what draws you to that?
Well, I mean, I'm not entirely sure what it is exactly. When I began writing at high school, to begin with, I wrote just free verse. I just used to spew out pages and pages of formless stuff. Unlike Judy, I wasn't expressing my feelings. I was just writing anything that came into my head, I think. But I suppose I quickly felt a need to shape what I was writing, and I mean there are many ways of shaping what you write, and that literal, formal sense of how you pattern words on the page must have struck a chord. We were studying people like Keats and what have you. So there was, and even Australian poets, Judith Wright and what have you, A.D. Hope. So there was plenty of formal poetry there already in my background, and I was drawn to it, and I've always been drawn to it. I've never. I somehow feel. I find a lot of people say that. Surely, these formal structures are an inhibition to the imagination. But I find the contrary is true. I find that they actually, charge and vitalise the imagination. Having something to push against actually makes my imagination work more strongly.
Because you can't just write what you can't fancy writing, can you? You have to then get to the rhyme word.
That's right, so you've got to,
It is quite striking. As far as I remember, I can't see hardly any free verse at all.
No, I don't think I've ever published it. I think there are a couple of poems that could be called free verse, but they're still they're hidden in regular stanza shapes, but they don't have any rhyme or metre. But no, essentially no.
I mean, the other thing we were talking about beforehand is that, and it's still in Australia and it's to some degree in the UK, there's still this sort of downer on formal verse. Even people say people call you a formalist, an Australian formalist, as if you don't have any feelings, for instance. It's just sort of. Have you got any thoughts about why still, after all this time, formal poetry, in the sense of rhyming, metrical poetry, is still sort of. People think that you're going to be doing fox hunting if you write in rhyme and metre.
I suppose, well, in this country, it's probably associated with bush ballads and poetry like that, Banjo Patterson and what have you. But I suppose it was, when the modernist movement began at the beginning of the 20th century, basically at the beginning of the 20th century, they were trying to break down a lot of those traditions which they considered to be worn out, I suppose, and stultifying poetic language. And a lot of that was thrown overboard. Although, interestingly enough, Eliot used both rhyme and meter at various stages throughout his life. But anyway, but he also wrote free verse. And free verse became established as the new kind of default mode, and that has never really been challenged. Although there has always been a lot of formal verse still written.
It still is now.
It never stopped being written. But it did fall under a shadow. And certainly in this country, I think that is still the case.
I mean, the other thing one of the main things I was excited about reading when I first read the Red Sea, and the new collection, Exhibits of the Sun, is what seemed to me as a very careful balancing act, which I thought was interesting. This balancing, which seems to me to be mirrored by your rigours of metre and rhyme, is a sort of balancing act between panache on one hand and I've written it down, I've forgotten it. I'm a bit jet-lagged with my right? Oh dear. Panache and decorum is what sort of struck me. I think it's decorum particularly struck me because decorum is very, very rarely writers in any genre value decorum, but there's a sort of decorum in your work, but balanced with sort of panache. I'm writing a critique here. There's a I don't know whether if you've not read Stephen's poetry, there's a dignity and care about the writing. So, for instance, you're very unseduced by the demotic. You don't write down, which is very much the fashion now, is to write down to show that you're down there with the kids. Can you say something about these sort of twin, if I'm right, this sort of mixture of panache and decorum?
Yes, I hadn't thought of that, really. Well, in terms of panache, I mean, we go back to the Dylan Thomas influence. I've always been, that one tends to get carried away by language itself. And I suppose that's always been one of my possible, failings. Is it that tendency to let rip, with whatever sounds good. It may not be what you meant to say, but it sounds good. But that has to then be moderated, I suppose, by a need. I would say that an increasingly felt need over the years to try to have some level of accessibility and clarity. I think there's so much modern poetry, seems to me, to almost, shun a readership if it is so hermetic that it almost snubs, its nose at a readership, at the public.
Again, that's a result of modernism, partly. It's sort of a conscious attempt to sort of say this is high art and you probably won't be able to understand it.
And I think a lot of people have been scared off poetry because they think that they can't understand it, and a lot of it is incomprehensible.
Carrying on about your work, the other thing I wanted to bring out is that you're, again, I think you're in many ways rather unfashionable in some of your, that, I mean that as a compliment, by the way, just in case. Be careful with these things. Is your willingness to relish beauty. There is darkness and terror in your work. In fact, there's quite a lot of foreboding and shadow, but there's a determination to relish beauty, and that relishing of beauty becomes an almost religious revelry. I wonder whether you would say something about that.
Well, I have thought about that quite a lot over the years. I think that life has a lot of darkness and horror in it, and yet the physical world is so beautiful. So that we have this, we are these conscious beings with our sufferings and our pleasures, of course, but we're in this world of intense beauty. And I suppose, in a way, my poems perhaps try to mirror that beautiful forms with, beautiful natural imagery, but sort of a darkness or a shadow in there as well.
The poem, for instance, The Red Sea, is very, very much a very careful balancing out between beauty, including the beauty of children, the innocence of children, the beauty of the natural world, with this terrible sort of shadowing, a very, very carefully sort of calibrated poem, it seems to me. The other thing that I've noticed very much in your poems is that it's almost as if you're writing, which is particularly striking given that it's so wedded to rhyme and metre, that it seems to be trying to keep pace with change. You have wonderful descriptions of the sky, for instance, changing, changes in the light being seems to be one of your preoccupations almost. It sounds rather negative, but as well as your instinct for art and philosophy. But there does seem to be an essay on change within the work. I don't know whether that's your sense.
Yes, I hadn't thought of it in precisely those terms, but yes, there is a concentration on changing effects in the natural world, and I suppose
in the mind. And it's unusual to be able to track that so carefully, given that you often write in rhyme stanza patterns, and that seems to be your most sort of common usage. Very, very. I don't know if you've ever written in stanza patterns. Very, very difficult. Each line has to be the same metrical feet. That verse pattern has to repeat in terms of the rhyme scheme and in terms of the metrical feet of each. I've been trying to write in that way myself, and I described to a friend, and he said it sounded like mental self-harm.
But just to bring in that point about change, I mean, the stanza patterns I use generally have changing line length. They're not written in all one line length.
No, indeed,
so there's also that change there.
Right,
long lines and short lines in those patterns.
Yes, indeed. So I want to try and open it back to the both of you again now, if I can. So, Judith, I was thinking, through your career of writing, you've imagined other people very much, and you've imagined worlds that are, quite almost unimaginably distant from ours, like ancient India, for instance. You've imagined them very, very vividly. So I wanted to ask you, sort of, you've been lecturing in Sydney. What's the good of poetry for you, and what's the good of it for us? Obviously one of it might be to do with the imagination in that way, but I'd be interested to hear what.
Ooh, that's a big question.
Yeah, I always like to finish with a big one. Part of my style.
Well, I think I'll start with the personal one first. There's so many benefits that I get from poetry. It's been my life's passion since I was 17, so I feel very, very lucky and privileged to have a passion in life. I love writing, even though I find it quite difficult and challenging. I still love the actual process of sitting down and trying to create something, not necessarily knowing what it is you're going to create exactly, but just engaging, I suppose, with that part of yourself that is the creative, I think, most interesting part of oneself. So I feel very privileged to be able to do that. I love reading other people's poetry. I can just think of so many poets who've just meant so much to me, and their poems have just enriched my life in such profound ways. So I just think poetry is the supreme art form. I love words. I think words are fantastic things, not only for their meaning, but just for their body, their sounds and so forth. I think, and I guess all that I've just said then kind of answers the other question in a way too. I just think that any engagement with the arts really is an enlarging of yourself. I just think it develops your sensibility, it refines your sensibility, because I think when you're trying to perfect an art form, you constantly really have to keep working on your own ability to perceive and discriminate and take the world in and find that special thing, that essence. So I just think it's a wonderful process for enriching your own life, enlarging your consciousness, your being.
Big question.
I'll leave it there.
Very difficult to add anything to that.
So I'll turn to you, Leslie. One of the things that is striking about your work, just as an aside, I noticed that seagulls end both the selected poems and exhibits of the sun. You write
that poem, yeah.
You write wonderfully about seagulls and about the sea, and but there's this strong philosophical impulse in the poems, a need, it seems to me, to rejoice in things as they are. I can't remember which poem I'm thinking, but there's one, Unto Robert Gray, which describes the seagulls on the shore like a piece of artwork where you just follow.
That's right.
And the black tarpaulin is blown along.
Yes, it's called
that's
Coogee.
Coogee,
It's a beach,
right.
yeah.
Yeah, it's sort of a determination to sort of rejoice in things as they are. And what brought me to mind something that Seamus Heaney said. He thought that literature was strong enough to help. It was a lovely way of putting it.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether that's true of you for yourself, and true of poetry generally.
Does it help me?
Both.
Yes, it does. But I don't think that literature or poetry is necessarily, consoling or redeeming. But I've always just felt this need to make something from experience rather than just living. If I go for any period of time without having written a poem, it worries me. And poetry is this means of trying to make something, permanent maybe, permanent from living, and it has been, I suppose, it's been that central pursuit in my life. I mean, I have, in many ways, I'm an extremely negative sort of person, and I'm often sort of, overwhelmed by senses of, futility and meaninglessness, what have you. So poetry is a way, I suppose, of holding on to something that can counter that, make something positive. Out of
And is it that for us, do you think?
Well, I think it can. I mean, poetry has an astonishingly high failure rate. But the good ones, the great ones, they're inexhaustible. And somebody described poems as little, machines for remembering themselves. Or something.
John Patterson.
Yeah, and they, they sort of, as it were, encapsulate some experience and pass it on, and the reader can, read it out, as it were. The experience is channeled into that poem, and it's there perpetually for other people to unpack and relive.
And remarkably durable, really.
If the good ones, they last centuries or millennia.
So that's a good place to finish. Thank you very much, both of you.